coming. There are quite a few new faces here actually. So the PSA, Political Studies Association, is a learned society that exists to promote the study of politics. It's essentially an academic organisation, but we try and engage more broadly and take our research out into the wider world. In the past, we have always at this time of year run a few more briefings because more has been happening. So this year, no point in trying to spin out the whole series, so we'll have one focused obviously on the local election. Sorry it was had to be delayed till so close before the election, but obviously there's a pretty good reason why we didn't do it last week. We thought we'd probably have about 3 people of that. I'm going to just add one thing very quickly. We have relaunched our website. We have now an experts directory for the media. We're still trying to encourage all our members to actually fill in all the details, but then you'll be able to search on certain key things so that you know esteemed colleagues, but there are other people doing really interesting work out there, and it might be that you want to identify some new people, so do please take a look at that. The website address, I'm sure, well, it's psa.ac.uk. We've also got details of all the speakers here. The format is always that we have about half an hour of presentations and then plenty of time for questions, aiming to finish at about 10:30. You've got sort of overview notes, executive summary in your pack, but the actual slides we will send out to you later. And sort of in a day they'll go up on our website, but we'll email all the presentations to you. We're going to just video the presentations, but not the questions, if that's okay. We presume you prefer it that way.
Should we do the way around? Quality usually comes in the questions.
Well, if you're happy for us to record the questions, then we will do so, but we thought you'd be helpful. Okay, we'll start with John, who you all know, so we need to take first John first and check that.
See you. All right. I've been asked to talk about, as it were, the political landscape more generally, so I'm going to say virtually nothing about local elections in particular. I'm leaving that to Colin and Michael. I'm also anticipating that, as it were, certainly parts of this are probably familiar to all of you. But maybe you've not necessarily had the time to kind of think about how it all fits together, and frankly more invited by this task to do so. So I'm going to take it fairly quickly and rely on questions for when you say, hang on, that wasn't quite clear, or whatever. I'm essentially going to talk about each of the 4 principal GB/English parties to the moment. Clearly the most interesting thing about the current political scene is the rise of UKIP. How do you understand that? What is the character of its support? I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on that. The rise of UKIP and the election problems of the Conservatives are clearly interlinked, so you naturally leads me on to looking at the sources of the Tories' troubles. I will then simply say a little bit about the Democrat losses. Not much point in crying over spilt milk, and the milk has been spilt now for at least 2 years and doesn't certainly chance of going back into the bottle. So there's not much new to say about that. Then say a little bit about the position of the Labour Party, the strength and weakness of its position. And then, although it may have absolutely no relevance to the elections, arguably it is the most important part between now and 2015, I'll just get you up to speed on where public opinion is at in Scotland on the referendum. Okay. This chart is based on an average of those opinion polls that have been conducted on a regular monthly basis ever since May 2010, the YouGov, Comres, Ipsos Mori and ICAN are the ones who do faithfully every month, at least once a month, do a poll, and these are simply the average shares across those polls. And it's simply to remind you that essentially there have been 2 significant developments during the course of this Parliament in terms of changes in the popularity of the parties. The first is now very long-standing, which goes back to the autumn of 2010, when Liberal Democrat support fell away, and when, in the wake of that, the Labour Party became competitive as a political party relatively rapidly, despite the seriousness of its defeat in the 2010 general election, such that by the beginning of 2011, the Labour Party already had a narrow win with the Conservatives. The second clear development is that about 12 months ago, George Osborne tried to tax pasties and caravans and grannies, and while not taxing millionaires quite so much, and meanwhile Theresa May couldn't work out how many days there were in 3 months, all of which seems to have coincided with a significant fall in Conservative support. A fall which has not hitherto been reversed, indeed more recently showed some signs of going further. That, however, has not been particularly associated with a rise in support for the Labour Party, but rather, as you will be aware, it's been associated with a rise in support for UKIP, which even in the kinds of polls that I'm looking at are now probably doing at least as well as the Democrats in terms of voting intentions. And this is a phenomenon that you begin, basically, as you can see from here, the rise of UKIP starts at pretty much the same time as the increase in the Conservative electoral troubles in the spring of 2012. I know there is one internet pollster in the room. It has to be said that the polling industry at the moment does not entirely agree as to exactly how well UKIP is doing. It agrees that UKIP support's been going up, but for the most part, the telephone pollsters are still persistently coming in with somewhat lower estimates for UKIP than the internet pollsters. Though if Peter Calner were here, he would insist that actually UKIP's polling is not actually as high as most of the other internet pollsters. So there's also, in truth, some variation in between. But I think the most striking fact that mode is certainly making a difference is that comrades who each month do one poll by telephone and one by the internet persistently find a much higher level of support for UKIP on the internet, even though, as it were, the questions they are asking and the way in which they calculate voting intentions is exactly the same on both polls. So for whatever reason which we may want to debate, mode still seems to make a difference. Now, this is a kind of oblique reference to local elections. Given where we are currently at in terms of the position of the political parties, i.e. 39, 31, UKIP, I think 12, the Lib Dems at about 11, what does that mean in terms of, where are we now as compared with where we were when the local elections this year, the seats were last fought? The answer, of course, is that 4 years ago, the Labour Party was in a rather difficult place. It's now in a much better place. And basically, the Conservatives and the Democrats are now in a much worse place, and they're pretty much more or less equally in a worse place. Worth bearing in mind, however, that because the last elections were in June 2009, that on the same day as the European elections, UKIP did rather well, and therefore that 12% actually represents a 5-point increase in UKIP's Westminster voting intentions as of June 2009. Also worth bearing in mind that if you go before 2009, the seats that have been fought this year were last fought on the same day as the 2005 general election, and as compared with that, the Democrats are certainly in trouble, but notice that Labour's position at the moment is somewhat, but not dramatically stronger than it was then. So again, that suggests, gives you some pointers as to what, if the parties were fulfilling the polls, what might be happening now. But Colin and Michael will say much more about that. Now, I've read quite a lot of somewhat, in my view, slightly garbled analysis about where UKIP's vote's coming from, and people trying to insist it doesn't just hurt the Tories because they can find two men and a dog who did vote Conservative in 2010 and are now supporting UKIP. Therefore, this is not just a Conservative problem. Now, the truth is, as I would always tell you, it is never ever the case that all the votes simply go from one direction to another and there's no kind of variation around that. That, of course, is nonsense. However, if you just simply look at the innards of the opinion polls and look at what people said they were doing in 2010 and what they're saying they will do now, you see it's perfectly clear that the Conservative Party is losing a higher proportion of its vote to UKIP than Liberal Democrats and certainly the Labour Party. And these figures are simply showing you, for example, that in the most recent Comrades poll, 19% of those folk who said to Comrades, yeah, we voted for the Conservatives in 2010, are now saying that they would vote for UKIP, assuming they've got a voting intention at all. Liberal Democrat figure 11, Labour just 4. So it's perfectly clear if one looks at this that indeed, in terms of differential impact, it is the Tories who are suffering, and there is now this very substantial flow from Conservative to UKIP. That doesn't mean, of course it doesn't mean, that everybody who's currently a UKIP supporter voted Conservative in 2010. What I'm now doing is turning it around. This is actually the current composition of UKIP support broken down by what the folks did in 2010. And basically, yes, even with those very dramatic flows, it remains the case that at most about a half of existing UKIP supporters are ex-Tories, so it's very, very easy to find other people who did not vote Conservative in 2010 who are now supporting UKIP. That doesn't prove that UKIP isn't hurting the Tories most. It very clearly is. The second thing I want to say about this is that Nigel Farage has said a great deal about we're not just getting votes from the Tories, we're getting support from other people. That actually is very, very difficult to identify from the national polls, because the national polls, when they publish their tables at the moment, do not usually tell us whether people voted UKIP last time, let alone whether they voted abstained last time. Again, for the pollster who is here, please add that to your tables. So the purple bar here are actually the proportion of current UKIP voters who either voted for Plaid, SNP, BNP or whatever, or they didn't abstain, or they voted for UKIP. And they do constitute about a third of it, but many of those folk almost undoubtedly are in fact existing UKIP voters. The one poll that you can do the further differentiation is in ICMs, but unfortunately ICM is the poll that has fewest UKIP voters. But that certainly suggests the vast bulk of this purple column are actually 2010 UKIP voters. So again, you can even look at it this way. Just remember, UKIP is very much, as it were, protesting Conservative voters. Just very quickly, a little bit about the character of UKIP support, because there are some quite striking social demographic variations, some of which you might expect from a party that's taken for the Tories, and some which you wouldn't, and some of which are kind of give you some idea as to why the social conservatism of UKIP is an integral part of its appeal. Very substantial age gap. Older people much more likely to vote for UKIP than younger people. There's also a gender difference. Most polls find that men are more likely to vote for UKIP or support UKIP than women. For those of us north of the border, there's an interesting parallel with the fact that the SNP find it easier to get support amongst men and amongst women, and that there's to that degree there's a similarity in the pattern of support for these two rather different kinds of nationalism. There's also a little bit of a social profile difference, and there's a social profile difference you wouldn't necessarily expect from former Conservative voters, and I think it's probably one of the reasons why people are saying, this is not just a Conservative phenomenon, i.e. certainly those who are professional managerial in the AB social grade are pretty consistently less likely to say that they are going to vote for UKIP. And again, that's what you would expect for a party for which social conservatism is at least part of its appeal, because social conservatism tends to be higher amongst those with lower educational qualifications and therefore in more manual occupations. Okay, so it's an interesting social profile which isn't necessarily exactly what you'd expect given its origins, but perhaps is what you'd expect given some of the nature of its appeal. Now, why are we where we are? This is where we start talking about the nature of the Conservatives. There are quite a few opinion polls that have been asking people for quite some time now, who do you trust more to run the economy? Do you trust Cameron and Osborne, or do you trust Balls and Miliband? Now, that's interesting, but the trouble with that question is that if it changes, you don't know whether it changes because people's evaluation of, let's say, Cameron and Osborne has gone down, or whether their evaluation of Miliband and Balls has gone up. And there is, however, a lovely time series in Comrade's Sunday polls in which they, on a not pretty consistent basis, have been asking people separately, how much do you trust Cameron and Osborne, and how much do you trust Miliband and Balls? And this, as you, I think, is much more illuminating. And the first thing to say here, this is how much people trust the Conservative team, and you can see how, again, in spring 2012, the level of trust in the Conservatives' perceived economic competence fell away quite markedly. So what was previously something oscillating around 30% has since been oscillating around 25%. And this, at least, is one of the things at least has helped to dislodge people from Conservative to UKIP, is also kind of, at least it's not confirmed, but there's evidence consistent with it, is that indeed those folk who are current UKIP voters are amongst those who are now deeply sceptical about the Conservatives' economic competence. So that certainly suggests that, as it were, in terms of at least people being shaken off the Conservative tree and being apples that were willing to fall somewhere, the Conservatives' difficulty over the economy is part of the story as to why UKIP are rising. The second part of the story is, of course, if the Democrats weren't there to be available as a protest party anymore, that is a consequence of the fact that there is now a coalition. The other thing to say, again, just to show you how spring 2012 is important, notice how satisfaction with Cameron since then has been consistently much more negative than it was beforehand. So again, evidence that competence is now more of a problem for the Conservative Party. But then, those apples having fallen off the tree, and even bearing in mind the Liberal Democrats aren't available, what are the forces of attraction that are taking people to UKIP? And again, I think this is a story that many of you are familiar with, is that basically, yes, it's partly to do with Europe, but it's not just to do with Europe, it's also very clearly to do with immigration. A concern that's been there for a long time, but it's one that UKIP are successfully articulating, not least, of course, because the only way you can really control immigration to the UK is if you get out of the European Union, a point that UKIP are very strongly making, and where perhaps arguably also that concern about immigration doesn't get any easier in an age of continued economic austerity. This is Lord Ashcroft's poll in Eastleigh, in which people were asked, what was the most important issue for you in deciding how to vote? UKIP voters actually more likely to mention immigration in Europe. Liberal Democrat voters mention the local council if they mention anything at all. It is also pretty clear this is going on nationally, although you have to do a little bit of digging into YouGov's polls to see this. But what I'm showing you here is the percentage of all voters, first of all, who mention a party other than Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat as being the best party on these various issues. Unfortunately, YouGov don't tell us which party they mention. But as you can see, Europe and asylum and immigration top the poll in terms of voters naming a party other than those three. And then the clue that indeed this is almost undoubtedly UKIP is to be seen from the fact that then what YouGov do tell us is what percentage of UKIP voters are naming another party. And as you can see, UKIP voters are twice as likely to be naming another party, almost undoubtedly UKIP, on Europe and on asylum and immigration than they are on other issues. So again, this looks as though very much as these are the pulling factors. All of which kind of begins to make you understand why that speech by David Cameron on Europe was not indeed going to be an adequate and sufficient answer to the rise of UKIP, because it wasn't just simply to do with we don't like Brussels bossing us around. It's more fundamental than that. That doesn't mean to say that Cameron's speech didn't have an impact, or at least it didn't have an impact in the short term. YouGov, nicely through the whole build-up to, long build-up to Cameron's speech, were tracking whether people would vote for or against staying in the European Union. And as the speech became imminent and became unveiled, so opinion towards Europe became less hostile. And i.e., once the public were given the opportunity to perhaps be able to say, yeah, well, okay, you can stay in Europe, but we have a looser arrangement, that seemed to appeal to a certain section of the Eurosceptic audience. Now, most recent YouGov polls haven't come out again, but I think it also gives us a clue that if indeed Cameron were to hold this referendum and were to say vote yes, and we would probably discover in a repeated experience in the 1970s, the great British public would say, okay, we'll stay in that. Then just to remind you of the fact that, so we've got one part of the coalition, clearly now fighting for votes with UKIP. That's one battle that's going on. Meanwhile, there is that still long-standing 2-year-old battle. The Liberal Democrats have just been losing votes to the Labour Party. And just to affirm this, you can see from this slide, somewhere between a quarter and a third of 2010 Liberal Democrat voters are now in the Labour camp. So the other part of the coalition is not in a battle with UKIP particularly, it's in a battle with the Labour Party. So you've now got two separate battles going on in English politics. Whereas the previous model was where you've got Conservative and Labour competing with each other, and insofar as they exchange votes, the Liberal Democrats tend to be a bridge through which those that votes would switch. So if the Conservatives were unpopular, people went for the Democrats. If the Labour Party was popular, people went from the Democrats to Labour. So the Liberal Democrats were at the hinge between the two. Now we are in a different world. We're in a world where we've got two different competitions going on. We've got a competition between the Conservatives and UKIP, another competition going on between Labour and the Democrats. And in a sense, who governs Britain is not so much about the direct battle between the two principal parties, but who can lose or gain most from these two very different competitions. And obviously, to that extent, therefore, the Labour Party's support is very much, and studying the polls depends very much on its ability to hang on to that Liberal Democrat support, which is non-trivial. Again, looking at what is the current composition of Labour support, up somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 5 current Labour supporters are former Liberal Democrats, which when you start doing the maths is roughly about 6% of the vote. take that 60% of the vote away from the Labour Party, and the Labour Party's lead doesn't quite disappear, but becomes an awful lot narrower. So that's how crucial that source of support is. And then the question, of course, is how well placed is the Labour Party to hang on to this vote? And this is where some of the doubts arise. This is the Comrades' question for Labour Party on do you trust Labour Party to run the economy? There is no evidence, despite the decline in trust of the Conservative support of the Conservative team, there is no evidence that the Labour Party is trusted any more now on the economy than it was 2 years ago. Equally, George Osborne's line about, I know the cuts are terrible, but what we're here to do is to clear up Labour's mess, still very, very clearly has resonance. The Labour Party is still much more likely to be blamed than the coalition for the cuts. Though, bear in mind, given that the crucial target group for the Labour Party is to hang on to those former Liberal Democrat voters, note that 2010 Liberal Democrat voters regard the two principal, actually the Labour Party's position on the economy looks somewhat more favourable than that of the Conservatives. So to that extent at least, looking at the overall position may be somewhat of a misleading impression. That said, clearly again, obviously the second question mark hanging over the Labour Party is the popularity, or the lack of popularity of Ed Miliband. It's still there. It appeared to close somewhat in the second half of last year. It's opened up again. What perhaps is kind of quite interesting to do, and perhaps is kind of a cautionary note to the Labour Party, is what I've done here is to take Maury's series and to show you where Miliband stands 2.5 years in terms of net satisfaction, 2.5 years into being opposition leader in terms of net satisfaction, and where all his predecessors were at the equivalent stage of being opposition leader. Now this is a slightly biased sample because some opposition leaders didn't make 2.5 years, like Ian Duncan Smith. But notice that the three opposition leaders who did eventually become Prime Minister at this stage in their premiership were in positive satisfaction territory. Even by that stage, Thatcher, albeit only narrowly, was on the one Maury reading we've got for that time. In contrast, however, it has to be said that Miliband's position is not in the same dire situation as either Hay or Michael Foot. That said, and given there's still concerns about the Labour Party's position, and I'm not going to go into the detail of this, just to remind you, probably the most important political development in terms of the likely outcome of the 2015 election to have occurred in the last 12 months was the decision of a number of Tory backbenchers to vote down the House of Lords reform in effect, thereby giving Nick Clegg the excuse to scupper the boundary review, and the scrapping of the boundary review undoubtedly has a major impact on the chances of the Conservative Party getting a majority. And what I'm now doing is just taking Anthony Wells's data and comparing the targets for Labour and the Conservative in terms of the lead of each other in order to get an overall majority on the old boundaries, i.e. the ones that will be in place, and on the new boundaries, and just showing it for different levels of Liberal Democrat support. And however you cut it, life for the Conservatives does look rather difficult. Finally, this is where we are in Scotland. This is what you get if you average the opinion polls when you take out the don't knows and the won't says, which for some reason people are not inclined to do as yet, which gives you a misleading impression. And you average those opinion polls. The first columns are all those polls that last year asked people, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country? The right-hand one are the polls that this year that have asked people, should Scotland be an independent country? The answer is snap, nothing's changed. It's a 3-2 lead for no. It's not so large that we say it's in the bag, but it is sufficiently large and sufficiently stable that we say the yes side certainly has got an awful lot of work to do. And that's basically the conclusion.
Right.
Are our signs after this?
Yeah.
There you go.
Very efficient.
Colin, do you want
Okay. I shall talk briefly, and then Con will tell me what's going to happen in the local elections. The county elections have a special place in our collective heart, one we share. In as much as 28 years ago, someone said, I think it was me, wouldn't it be a good idea to collect the county council election results and, like a couple of hamsters inside the cage, we've been collecting them overseas. So, but before that, of course, we were collecting by-elections. So we started on the soft drug before we were on the hard. So for those of you who are not familiar with this, what we do in the by-election model is basically we're trying to present an alternative view of the state of public opinion, rather than asking people how they might vote in some putative general election. We actually take the data from local council by-elections and reconfigure those into a kind of national vote share. We've been doing this for a substantial time, and this is the picture since the general election. So there's the Conservatives, and you can see more or less what John's been showing on the polls. The Tories above around about 37. The general election declining now, somewhere in the high 20s. And Labour again overtakes them again, more or less as the poll suggests. Rather like the polls, though, what's interesting is what's happened to the Liberal Democrats, because more or less throughout a long period prior to the 2010 general election, the Liberal Democrats kind of defied gravity in terms of what the polls were saying and what they could actually achieve by way of votes in the ballot. But a rather interesting thing happened when they went into government, is that very rapidly their performance in the local council by-elections sort of dropped through the floor, and it's more or less stayed in that position ever since. One of the reasons why these lines are relatively smooth is because I'm showing you here a weighted 3-monthly average. So each kind of data point is 1 month, and then a little bit more of the previous month, and a little bit less than the previous month, and even less of the other. So it's a way of kind of smoothing the line, and also getting rid of some by-election that just anyone who follows the by-elections realises that from 1 week to the next thing, you just can't explain it. There's something weird. And the rise of others in council by-elections is a rather interesting development. Some of this is UKIP, not all of it. It seems that people are voting for anyone as long as it's not the party establishment, which is kind of an interesting feature of this parliament. So, again, using the same procedure, this is a weighted average of the polls. So we take account that YouGov are polling every hour or so. So we take every month's poll, and then we correct for the fact that some are only doing one and some are doing more than one. And we also factor in the quarterly smoothing average as well. And you can see there that in terms of the comparison between the way people are actually performing in terms of voting and actually what they're saying in answer to the question, how would you vote if there were an election tomorrow, the responses and the actions of people vis-a-vis the Conservatives are pretty close together. Now, again, those people who are familiar with the by-election model that we've presented over the years will know that that's a fairly common theme. These two lines do track one another rather smoothly. So not only are Conservatives admitting that they would continue to vote Conservative, they are actually doing it as well. But something rather interesting has happened with regard to Labour. It used to be the conventional wisdom of those people that actually spoke to us about this, that we'd all agree that Labour could never perform as well or as its opinion poll. And the biggest gap was during the Blair era, when Blair's poll rating and Labour's poll rating was stratospheric, and we were saying all along, hang on, it's not quite like that. But what these two lines, in my view, these two lines are coalescent. There's a sort of sense in which the way in which people are performing and the way in which people are responding to the question, how would you vote, with respect to Labour, it's kind of more of an agreement.
Which line is which?
Always the solid line is the by-election model. Sorry, I should have explained that.
So you're saying the Labour's current share as of by-elections is higher than its current opinion poll voting intentions?
No, at the moment they're virtually the same.
Right, but the blue line for the most part is higher than the red line.
Oh, sorry. No, the blue line is the polls. Yeah.
Right, okay.
The red line is what they're actually getting.
Right.
But they've actually, those two lines, the point I'm making is that the gap used to be like
Yeah,
this,
okay.
and it's now kind of narrow.
Right, fine.
Yeah. And then the Liberal Democrats are doing what they've always done in the model, where they've always performed better in actual votes in the council by-elections. And you'll note, rather intriguingly, there's a kind of, if you study it closely, there's a small beginning to rise at the end of that data. Speaking optimistically. And there's others. So the line for others in terms of the by-elections is rather more erratic. It's partly to do with where the by-elections are and whether these parties are standing. But again, over the past 6 months or so, over the last year or so, UKIP have clearly begun to fight more council by-elections than they have done previously. Just to remind ourselves of the Sunday Times time series, again, people who follow these very closely will know that these numbers are going to be slightly different from those that the BBC put out. But in terms of the 2009 situation, Labour was in 3rd place in terms of the national government level. So Labour is, if you think that they're around about 38, and there really is a spring, as John's slides show, there really is a spring in the step there. You obviously need to know about how well we did last time we had this presentation. We forecast 34 for the Tories and the outcome was 33 in 2012. Labour, we got 37. We forecast 37 and 39. And the Lib Dems, we were generous.